and we're going to be looking at verses 28 to 44, which I just read. 19, 28, 44. Did you find that you were singing the authorized version of Words and Fight On in Majesty? I must say, as opposed to the NEB. But I understand the reason for the folk who devised those words for doing so. So we're remembering Palm Sunday this morning, and it's the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem on a donkey. Now, he's been into Jerusalem many other times. When you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, he is a frequent visitor to Jerusalem. In fact, John's gospel, his ministry is focused in Jerusalem. But on this occasion, he acts to declare that he's Messiah. His going in on a donkey is a declaration of who he is. I'm Messiah. But I want you to notice this, that while he's making this declaration, I'm Messiah, he's not saying, I'm claiming Herod's throne. One of the interesting and odd aspects of this particular episode in his ministry is that around Jerusalem at that time were quartered 3 legions, because the Jews at the time of Passover were more likely to be expressing rebellious actions against the Romans. The Barabbas, who was going to be crucified, whose cross Jesus took. He's an example of the kind of unease that was around Jerusalem. And yet, oddly, they take no notice of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Now, what's the significance of this coming into Jerusalem? 1917, General Allenby, he was leading the British Army of Egypt up through Palestine to take Jerusalem, fighting the Turks on the way. And his opinion of the Turks was that they were valiant soldiers in the field of battle. He comes to Jerusalem, and he comes to the St. Stephen Gate. He's wearing the insignia of a general. He takes off his cap, he takes off the badges of rank, he gives his swagger stick to his Batman, he gets off his horse, and he walks through the St. Stephen Gate on foot, because he said, the King of Kings came into Jerusalem on a donkey. Who am I, as a mere soldier, to go in as a general? And he went in as a private soldier. And that's reflecting on the importance and the significance of this event. What's happening? I'm going to divide up these verses 4 ways. We're looking at verses 28 to 44. We're going to divide it up 4 ways very quickly. We're going to see Jesus proclaims himself Messiah, verses 28 to 36. We're going to see the crowds acclaim him as king, verses 37 to 38. We're going to see the Pharisees' frustrations with him over his disciples, verses 39 and 40. And then the awful reality that God abandons Jerusalem in verses 41 to 44. So Jesus is approaching Jerusalem. He's going up the hill to Jerusalem from Jericho. He's coming to the outskirts of Jerusalem, and he sends 2 of his disciples to Bethphage, probably a suburb of Jerusalem. And he says, in Bethphage, you'll find a donkey hitched up. Go and get that donkey and bring it to me. And if anybody says to you, oh, you can't take that donkey, that doesn't belong to you, say to them, the Lord needs it. Now, the Lord needs it. It's a courtesy. It's a courteous turn of phrase. Our rabbi needs it. But I want you to hear in it an echo of what's happening in this story. The Lord needs it. The title of majesty and sovereignty. And the Spirit of God is saying to us, Jesus is about to do something which is highly significant. So they go into Bethphage, they unhitch the donkey, they bring it to him. His disciples put on a saddle of working men's clothes, and they put Jesus on the donkey. And then they ride over a carpet of working men's overcoats into Jerusalem. Jesus is consciously fulfilling the prophecy of Zechariah chapter 9 and verse 9 about the king who comes into Jerusalem on a donkey, a king who's bringing in a kingdom of peace, where the sword will be made into plowshares, whereas the spears will be changed into pruning hooks. And he's answering the question that the Pharisees and the leaders have been asking him time and time again. They've been hectoring him. They've been pestering him. Are you he? Are you the Christ? Who are you? And Jesus is making the declaration by going into Jerusalem on a donkey that I am Messiah. It would be remarkable when King Charles is crowned on May the whatever it is, if he was to turn up to Westminster Abbey in a Vauxhall Astra, year 19 registration, and get out wearing his gardening clothes to go and sit on the throne. The coronation of King Charles the Third will be a declaration of his temporal might and authority, of the 1,000 years of tradition that goes into our monarchy. Jesus' declaration to his people is that I'm the Messiah of that promised future eternal kingdom, and that kingdom is a kingdom of peace. And so they're making their way into the city. If you've ever been to Jerusalem, the road leads up and you come to the top of the city and you begin to make your way down into the city. Now, the festival is the Passover. And because you're required as a Jew, a Jewish man, you're required to be in Jerusalem for 3 feasts. The first one is Passover. And in order to accommodate everybody, the boundary of Jerusalem was extended a mile in every direction, so that you could say that you had celebrated the Passover within the limits of the city, but not necessarily within the city walls. So you properly observed Passover. So when we think of the crowds going into Jerusalem, don't think of a rivulet of people passing by going into Jerusalem. When we were in New Zealand a number of years ago, my wife and I were in Invercargill, and they had rush hour in Invercargill, and that was 1 car every 5 minutes. Big crowds of people, thousands of them, going into the city, coming out of the city, preparing for Passover. And as Jesus is entering into the city, his disciples have breasted the hill, and he's looking over the city, and you can see as you breast the hill, you can see to the left the temple, you can see to the right in the distance the Tower of David, you can see open in front of you the beautiful gate, and you can see behind the temple in all its glory, with its golden dome, you can see behind it Herod's palace. It's a stunning sight. And as Jesus comes over the hill, he's beginning to make his way down into the city. His disciples burst into spontaneous praise. Notice what Luke tells us. The whole multitude of his disciples began to rejoice and praise God with a loud voice. Please don't think King's College Choir, the Royal Choral Society. Please don't think Truro Cathedral Choir. Think of the raucous noise of a football crowd. And they're bursting out into this acclamation of who the Lord Jesus is. And it's not an acclamation of the imagination. It's an acclamation as a result of all that they've seen of his ministry, of his mighty works. Just 24 hours before, he's been coming out of Jericho, and blind Bartimaeus is sitting beside the wall and of the gate, and he shouts, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." The crowd around him say, "Shh, you're making us embarrassed." And he gets louder, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus hears him and he says, "Come to me." Now here's this blind man, he takes his cloak off. How did he know in which direction to go? Well, his hearing. He went straight for that voice. When he got to where the Lord Jesus was, Jesus said, "What do you want me to do for you?" And Bartimaeus says, "I want to see." And Jesus said, "According to your faith be it done to you." And all the crowd that was around Jesus saw this blind man see. And this blind man followed Jesus up to Jerusalem. There will have undoubtedly been some of the 5,000 men whose families joined them, which meant there were about 20,000 people that Jesus fed when he fed the 5,000. They chased around the Sea of Galilee to the eastern side because they knew he'd be there. They met him when he landed. He taught them all day and they didn't notice that they were hungry. And then at the end of the day, he provides food out of five loaves and 2 fish. And he simply says grace. And the miracle is so simple. He keeps breaking the bread, His disciples keep taking him around. The crowds are seated in 50s and 100s, and they're all given bread. And then he says, "Thank you for the fish." He keeps breaking the fish, Everybody has enough, a simple meal. The disciples go around with the koffinos fish baskets, which are out the side of the table there. And they fill them with 12 pieces left over. They fill 12 baskets full of the pieces that were left over. And there would have been folk in the crowd there, and they would have remembered that provision. Just a few weeks before, Jesus had gone from the eastern side of the Jordan River, and he'd heard that Lazarus was dead or dying. And he makes his way to Jerusalem after 3 days. When he gets to Bethany, in that tear-sodden chapter of John 11, he meets first of all Martha, who says, "Lord, if you'd been here, he would not have died." And Jesus says to her, "Do you believe that he will live?" "Yes, he'll live at the resurrection." Jesus said, "I'm the resurrection and the life." "Do you believe that, Martha?" She said, "Yes, I believe that." And then Mary comes out, who's seated at his feet, and of whom Jesus said in Luke 11, she's chosen the better part, not to fuss around making the meal, but to sit at my feet and to listen to the word of God. And she comes to Jesus and she says the same as her sister, "Lord, if you'd been here, he would have died." They go to the tomb. And Jesus weeps at the tomb. And then he says to the sisters, "Roll the stone away." Martha says, "What? The body will stink." And Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" And the stone is rolled away from the tomb. Jesus prays. And then he says in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And what should happen next is this shrouded figure who's making his way out to the mouth of the tomb. And Jesus said, "Untie him and let him go." And John tells us that there were lots of people who saw that. And they're praising God because of the mighty things that they have seen Jesus do. And they're crying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord," like Moses before Pharaoh, who showed the hand of God to persuade Pharaoh to let my people go. So God has anointed his Messiah to do those works that say, "Here is the King." Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, they say in verse 38. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest. They recognize Jesus as the Messiah. Now, I want you to notice that. They recognize Jesus as the Messiah, the future King. Now, in John chapter 6 and in Mark chapter 6, at the feeding of the 5,000, after the 5,000 have been fed, they want to make him king. And Jesus, with his awesome authority, dismisses the crowd. He rejects their willingness to make him king. And then he goes into the hill to pray, up the hill to pray. He refused their offer to acknowledge him as king. But here, he's proclaiming himself the Messiah. And they're responding with praise that we have the Messiah here. And they sing in a way that's no longer about releasing themselves from the hated Romans. It's about what God is going to do through his servant. When they get into Jerusalem, the crowd doesn't go to Herod's palace to kick him out. They disperse. Now, what's happened here? Well, Jesus said in Matthew 11, he says, "I thank you that you reveal these things not to the wise and understanding, but to little children." Now, it sounds demeaning, and he's not meaning to be patronizing. He's saying to us, to ordinary folk, God has shown who his Son is. The unlearned. It's amazing how the witness of the unlearned and the ordinary folk can be so persuasive. You've all heard of the Human Genome Project, I guess, an American thing. And its leader was a fellow called Francis Collins, who was a cancer specialist. And he proclaimed himself to be an evolutionary atheist. He was a brilliant doctor. He is a brilliant doctor and a brilliant scientist. He was also a practicing doctor. His care, he had people who were terminally ill of cancer. And he tells how he went to this, he was caring for this lady who was a Southern Baptist. And he couldn't work out why she was so happy when he told her that she was dying. And she said to him, "Dr. Collins, I know where I'm going because Jesus died for me and he's my Messiah. Dr. Collins, do you have that hope?" And he was a man whose yard arm was spangled with academic qualifications and honors. He couldn't answer her question. And that's what drew him to Jesus Christ. And it was these ordinary folk who saw what he did, who acknowledged his proclamation, who give him the praise that is his, because God showed them. And one of the problems that so many of the rabbis had with Jesus, because he hadn't been to Oxford and got a DD, he hadn't been to Cambridge, he wasn't a professor. He'd not been to college, he'd not sat at the foot of the rabbis. Paul had. Paul talks about how he sat at the foot of the rabbis. Paul talked about how he was an exceptional student. Jesus had none of those qualifications. And yet here was the one who spoke with God's authority, and not even the most learned of the teachers in the portico of Solomon could answer him. So Jesus goes into Jerusalem and he's proclaiming himself to be Messiah. Now notice the Pharisees' frustration in verse 39. Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." In a very real way, the English doesn't really give us the impression of the fervency of their. It's not, I say, do you mind? They're a bit of an embarrassment. It's shut them up. Notice what he said. They say first of all to Jesus, "Teacher." They acknowledge his role, but not his status. The crowds are singing about the king who comes in the name of the Lord. They're saying, "Teacher." They're refusing to accept whom the crowd says he is. Rebuke your disciples. Stop them praising you as Messiah. Stop them saying that. I want you to notice this too. If you follow Mark's gospel in Jesus' ministry in Galilee, you'll find that there's the Pharisees' posse that's following him around. Now, they're not going around to support him and to be positive. They're going around to criticize him, to find fault. They see his great works. They see them. But their hearts were hardened. We have to read John chapter 9. And in John chapter 9, Jesus heals a blind man. He spits on dust. He puts the dust on the blind man's eyes. So you have the blind man wearing red mud on his eyeballs. He goes and washes in the pool of Siloam. You can imagine him going around Jerusalem. He's staring at people. "You're the voice I heard." Oh, that's what you look like. You can imagine that. Very quickly, everybody hears about this blind man who now sees. And you can see 3 times the Pharisees in Jerusalem interrogate him and his parents. And the one remarkable thing is that what they're not willing to say is that Jesus gave him his sight. Their hearts were hard. Because you see, they saw him as a lawless Jew. Most of his great works were done on the Shabbat. And the point of his doing the works on the Shabbat, the Sabbath, was to point forward to that future Sabbath rest for the people of God. They were signs of a future rest. They weren't the acts of a rebellious Jew trying to shake off the shackles of the law. But all they saw was Sabbath laws broken. He convicted them of hypocrisy. He says, "You love to make long prayers." And you can see examples of their long prayers in Luke's gospel. You love to make long prayers, fellas. You love to go in flowing robes. You love the best places in the synagogues where people say, "What fine people you are." When in reality, you're hypocrites. Because you take widows' houses, you lie, you steal. He dismisses their teaching. At the end of Luke chapter 11, you can hear how Jesus deals with their teaching. And he says to them, "You stand by the tomb of Zechariah and you dab your eyes and you say, 'I would never have done that. I would never have rejected him.'" His message, and he says to them, not only would you have rejected his message, and not only would you have built the tomb, but actually you're guilty of all the blood of the prophets. Because one greater than all of them is here. And you're saying he's a liar. They heard the gospel. They saw the mighty works. But they didn't hear grace and mercy and the time of God's visitation. All they heard was a call to turn from their sin. And they wouldn't do it. And as the gospel story develops, their hatred of him becomes blind, incoherent rage. Jesus says in John chapter 15, they hate me without cause. And in verse 40, Jesus refuses, he refuses to say to his disciples, stop this shouting. He's saying to them, to the Pharisees, you hate what they say, but you can't suppress the truth of what they're saying. And if they didn't speak, the very stones they stand on, like the stars in the sky on the night when he was born, bore testimony to the one who was born in Bethlehem as to be the King of the Jews, bringing magi from the east. In the same way as creation proclaimed the glory of God, embodied in the child in Bethlehem. So creation would, if man said nothing, would proclaim, here is the King. Jesus is saying to these men, you cannot suppress this truth. They tried to. They really tried to enact it. But they failed. But I want you to notice last of all, Jesus abandons Jerusalem. God abandons Jerusalem. The crowd breasts the hill. This tumultuous shouting is going on, overwhelming. Jesus is sitting on his donkey, not taking it all in, but he's weeping bitterly. And it's not the stifled sobs of a man who's trying to be manly but can't hold it in. It's the sobbing of someone who is weeping with deep grief, because he says to them, the things that have been made for peace are now hidden from your eyes. You will crucify me. I'll be crucified outside the city wall. You will exclude me and reject me. And God will deal with you. Such is the wickedness of what you're about to do. God will abandon the temple and the city. Now, you and I, we hear it as demolition. We hear it as something that happens to a city. But within the Bible, the place where God's name is was the temple. The city of God was Jerusalem. The psalmist said, look around her, go about her, count her towers, consider well her ramparts, view her citadel. Tell it to the generations to come. This God is our God forever and ever, and he will guide us to the end. We're safe. And with the destruction of Jerusalem in the providence of God, it's God saying to Jerusalem, I've left you, and you're defenseless. Some 70 years later, you hear the bang of the 3 battering rams against the gates of Jerusalem. Big trips. They thump the wall. And every time they thump the wall, there's a wail that goes up from the city. The walls are breached, and Titus, General Titus, in command of the 3 legions around Jerusalem. The order of the day is rape, pillage, destruction. The streets of Jerusalem are combined with the gold that's melting from the roof of the temple, with the blood of the men and the women and the children that are being killed, and the bodies of people that are being crucified on the wall. And at the close of battle, the ropes that go and pull the city down, and the decree of Vespasian, this city will never be rebuilt. And you can see something of the awfulness of that if you look at the triumphal arch of Titus in the Roman Forum. You did not know the time of your visitation. But I want you to notice this, that all of this was happening according to the determinate plan and knowledge of God. And what they did when they crucified him on the cross, as the final and absolute act of rejection and humiliation, Jesus says is the place of his glory. And Jesus says of his cross that it's the place of his exaltation, where he draws all people to himself. And he says that his reign of peace begins at Calvary, where he bears the judgment of God against his people, where he brings his people into God's presence. At the cross, where he reconciles all of his people to God. The destruction of Jerusalem, if you reflect on those verses, gives you an inkling, just an inkling, of the wrath that Jesus bore when he died in our place, so that we might be heirs of that future kingdom of peace. And as he goes into Jerusalem on the donkey, he's saying, I'm the Messiah. Just 2 points in closing. I want to ask you this with all my heart. As we look at the disciples going into the city and they're praising, and the Pharisees that are embarrassed, if you were in that crowd, who would you be joining? Would you be praising him for his great works in your life? Or would you join the Pharisees in saying, you embarrass me? But I want you to notice this secondly. That kingdom of peace that he promised is for all those who, like every one of those people who knew his mighty works, trusted in him. So let's end our time together by singing the first of the hymn there, 422. He was pierced for our transgressions.